Welcome to this episode of Genomics Lite. My name is Sam.
And I'm Jack. We both work in the Wellcome Connecting Science team at the Wellcome Sanger Institute, and our roles are to enable everyone in the world to connect with and learn more about genomics.
If you haven't joined us before, then welcome to Genomics Lite. It's a series of short sessions that share the science that happens on our campus, which is all about DNA codes. This is our third video of our spring series, exploring some key questions about genomics that we get from people like you. Welcome to everybody joining the live stream, and don't forget to check out our other videos and subscribe to our channel after this one.
Today's session is a little different, and I'm really excited about it. We aren't focusing on biology today, but on social science, and in particular on trust. Why do people trust science or mistrust it? And why does that matter for DNA science in particular? So perhaps before we begin, Sam, can you tell us why are we talking about trust on Genomics Lite?
Yeah, so likewise, I'm super excited to get into this one. But yeah, this series has been all about the research that happens at the Wellcome Sanger Institute. But as well as having lots of biological research, we also have a fantastic team of social scientists working here. And one of them is our fantastic guest today. So yeah, we'll be introducing them a little bit later. But just so that people get this sense between biological science and social science. Biological science is the study of living things, and social science is the study of how those living things interact together. So, for on our campus, what this means is how scientists interact with communities, and likewise how those communities view and interact with genomic science. Um, and Jack, you are a global audience today, so tell us, yeah, you're currently working on a project right now that's a little bit connected to this. So tell us a bit more.
Yeah. International Genomics Lite today. I'm in Uruguay, so here in Montevideo in South America. And I'm part of a training course here that's working with scientists from across Latin America. The scientists here are doing some really brilliant research into parasitic worms. And this course is sharing with them some genomics techniques to enhance or enable that work, but also some engagement techniques to help connect that work with their local communities and make those local communities a part of the research, hopefully to enhance well, perhaps enhance trust, but certainly to make a bigger impact. So a big shout out to anyone who's joining us from Uruguay or from Latin America. Hola to you. But our core topic today is trust. So Sam, help me understand how that comes into the genomics work specifically on campus.
Yeah, so our campus creates and studies big data sets of those DNA codes, and to be able to make those big data sets, those big databases, people need to give their permission for us to read, sequence their DNA. Now, that might be patients in a hospital or members of the public who agree to take part in scientific research. So they need to be able to trust us that we are going to look after their DNA once we've sequenced it, once we've read it. And when we think about it, DNA is probably the most personal thing you could ask someone to share. So it's a really big ask for people to donate that information. So it's really important for us to understand why communities do or don't trust organizations such as ourselves, so that we can help scientists to find ways to build that trust in future, which in turn affects the data that we can collect um, and the science that we can do moving forward as well.
Well, I think this is the perfect time to introduce our guest. So, joining us today is Jonathan Goodman. He is a social scientist in the Research and Dialogue team here at the Wellcome Sanger Institute and also at Cambridge Public Health, which is a centre in the University of Cambridge. He has recently published a fantastic book called Invisible Rivals: How We Evolved to Compete in a Cooperative World. And I know that trust comes into that work. And he is an expert, a specialist as well on the erosion of trust and on human social evolution. So, the perfect person to join us for this conversation. Thank you very much for joining us, Jonathan.
Thanks so much for having me.
Well, set up the problem for us first, Jonathan. Why do I or any other individual need to think about trust and who deserves my trust?
Well, it's a very good question. It's quite a broad one. It stems back to almost in a way, our evolutionary history and thinking about how people form trusting bonds in smaller groups in which we are living. And there were various cues and tactics people use to form those bonds. But when you look now today, we live in groups where it's not possible to know every individual. We have institutions, we have political groups, we have all kinds of people and groups who are trying to influence how you think and what you do and what you believe. And so the heuristics that would have served us very, very well in our ancient evolutionary history are no longer that useful, right? And when it comes to something like science and science recommendations, and you have a bunch of people who are giving you evidence for how you should behave, looking, for example, the COVID-19 pandemic, where the evidence was changing all the time. Do we mask? Do we not mask? Do we shelter? Do we not shelter? Who should shelter? It's a moving target. And trying to impart that knowledge onto people requires that people place trust in the person speaking, and that can very easily be lost. Um, so that's the broad problem. I'll wait to go to genomics until we get onto it.
Yeah, great. Thank you. So we've already got this sense of two different two different people or camps involved in this problem of deciding trust. There's me, the individual, trying to decide who to trust, and then there are these people or organizations who want me to trust them. The case that you gave, the policymakers making rules for COVID. So we're going to talk about these two different concepts of trust and trustworthiness. Can you help to unpack those two? What are they and how are they different?
Right. I mean, it's two sides of the debate, right? On the one hand, people placed trust in others. Trust is something that I do uh, towards another person or another group. Trustworthiness is a quality that the person or group trying to win my trust may, or crucially, may not have. And the important question is how people who are trustworthy display that trustworthiness in order to win the trust of those they're trying to get. Because a bad actor can just as easily say, "Trust me," right? That's not proof that I'm trustworthy. So we have to have other means of demonstrating that we are worthy of a person's or groups or indeed the public's trust. That's what we call the trustworthiness recognition problem.
Uh, I I'd like to get a few examples for this for our viewers. So perhaps could you tell me, I'm a big organization. I want people to trust me. What are the kind of classic things that we see organizations do to display trust
Well,
or trustworthiness?
yeah, yes, it's a very good question. The only thing I would caveat that with is um, uh, the things they do may not work.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So evidence you see across science institutes and brands and corporations, governments, whatever, they may try to win trust in ways that just fundamentally don't work. And there's a lot of evidence of how that happens. Equally, if we discover ways that do tend to work, and then we say, hey, here's a good way of getting people to trust us, then the really nasty people out there who want to subvert science and subvert or use information against us, mis and disinformation, they can just copy those exact methods. So there is no quick fix to this problem, right? It's going to be contextual. It's going to depend on who is talking to whom, the connection between them, and so on and so forth. But I mean, in terms of medical and healthcare and genomics, one thing that we do repeatedly see is that the best way of opening a dialogue is to engage with people's concerns, right? Instead of saying, trust me, we need to shut up and we need to listen to what people are worried about.
Um, That I think that's a really delicious tension for us to keep a hold of through here is that yeah, there's no quick fix because as soon as if there were a quick fix, all the bad actors just take on that quick fix as
Yeah.
well. So yeah, it's a real problem for us, and I think certainly in the UK and I think in other countries as well with this TV show Traitors is very popular, isn't it? And I
Absolutely.
think we see that problem there, don't we? How do you decide who to trust? Um, Tell me for the organization, though, some of the impacts. So, thinking specifically of genomics organizations or healthcare organizations, why does it matter to them? Why can't I just say, oh, it doesn't matter whether people trust me or not?
Yeah,
Give
I mean
us a few.
that's a great point to start with, right? So when it comes to healthcare and genomics, we basically need as much information about the population as possible in order to tell what the issues are that we're dealing with in terms of public health, population health, and indeed individual risk for various kinds of diseases. So, for example, if we identify that a certain ethnicity is at a heightened risk for a subtype of cancer, we need data about that group of people in order to arrive at that judgment, or else we're flying blind, right? And something I've heard some researchers bring up, there's an old joke about a drunk man who lost his keys to his car, okay? And he's searching around a light out in a street lamp outside, and somebody walks over and says, "What are you doing?" He said, "Well, I'm looking for my keys. I can't find them." And he said, "Where do you think you lost them?" And he said, "Well, I think, over there somewhere on the grass." He's like, "Well, why are you looking here under the street lamp then?" And he says, that's where the light is." And the light in this case is the genetic and health information we have about the group. If we only have certain amounts of light and there's darkness in the rest of the territory, we can't tell what's going on at a population level. So, in order to combat the population health, public health, etc., problems that we're dealing with, we need information. We need to know what's going on with people's health and people's genetics at a population level.
I think that's you termed it a joke, but a beautiful metaphor to open up this challenge. Perhaps give us some more information on what that landscape looks like within genomics. Where is the light classically or historically, and where are the areas that currently we don't have good understanding
Yeah.
or data coverage?
Yeah. So classically, the light is in white, uh, Northern European, and US population. So other ethnicities that may be linked with lower socioeconomic status, they tend to not be well represented in these data sets. So a lot of the research that we're publishing in genomics basically has to do with people who are wealthier, who have been more exposed to advanced research programs and so forth. And lower trust groups, and we can get on to why there's lower trust among these groups, tend to be underrepresented in these data sets. And therefore, the light is not going to help improve health inequalities. In fact, it could exacerbate them to the degree that we don't know what's going on in certain subpopulations.
And some people listening to this might say, well, that's a problem that we see again and again all over, and it's to do with systemic issues within our societies. So where does trust come into that? We might say it's just because that's the populations in countries that have the money to do this kind of research, but I know that trust comes into this too. So unpack that a little for us.
Well, it comes in at every single level, right? And there are historical reasons why trust is going to be lower among certain groups of people. For example, in African Americans, there was a famous study, the Tuskegee syphilis study, that was conducted between the 1930s and the early 1970s, in which there were two cohorts of Black Americans. One had syphilis, one did not. And the group that had syphilis were not told they had syphilis. They weren't given any treatment, and they were just allowed their disease to progress. And researchers just monitored them, okay, to see what was happening between the infected and non-infected groups. People died, people developed paralysis. I mean, it was horrific what those researchers did. And it wasn't until the early 1970s, that's like 50 years ago, that people revealed that's what was going on. And understandably, that's made a lot of people, particularly African Americans and other ethnicities that are typically not well represented or let's say cared for effectively when it comes to health inequalities, made them have very, very low trust in medical research. And it's totally understandable why they do.
So this gets us into another tension that we'll speak about, which is the actions of bad actors, as we would deem them, as people um, who do things that damage trust, not just in themselves, but across a wider sector. So you're describing one group of researchers and their actions having impacts across a much broader section of healthcare. Yeah,
Reverberating actions. Yeah.
yeah. Um, tell me more about that. I think been a recent news story that I know has had some people talking about trust, um, that came out just over the course of the last few months, which was in the sector of genomics, and it was talking about dire wolves and the possibility of bringing these creatures back. You know, we always talk to the public and they ask us about Jurassic Park and things like that. Dinosaurs, we won't be talking about on this session, but dire wolves and mammoths and things like that. There are people that are saying we could bring these things back. So tell us a little of this story, and in particular, what it means for trust.
Well, I found the direwolf case very interesting. So, for those who don't know, there's a company called Colossal Biosciences. Um, they're valued at about $10 billion. And they claimed and continue to claim, if you go on their website, that they have resurrected the direwolf. The direwolf is an extinct animal that actually, as far as I understand, doesn't have that close of a genetic relationship with modern dogs. Um, but basically, these researchers identified 14 or 15, I can't remember the exact number, mutations that were meant to have existed in direwolves when they lived. And they uh, mutated living, well, extant canine genes in order to make them look more like direwolves. So 15 to 20 mutations, I can't remember exactly the number, but in terms of the genome, it's nothing. It was virtually nothing. So they end up with some essentially slightly modified dogs and call them direwolves.
Um, so the organization does this research, and they tell the world about the work that they've done. Um, I, as an organization, let's take it away from the organization that's specifically done this work, but say I own a genomics organization and I want to shout about the work that I've done. I'm going to put my particular comms spin on my work, and I do that because I'm a private organization that needs to raise revenue or things like that. Some other people might say, well, I think what you've done is different and should be talked about in a different way.
Hmm.
What's the trust impact here, and how does this connect to our topic?
Well, it's a very interesting question because when it comes to private companies, there's no hard and fast rule, right? We can't just say you're lying. Um, because what constitutes a species? It's a complicated question. I do think that they're massively overblowing what they've done. They have made significant achievements, right? They have placed in mutations in an animal in such a way that it does harken back to the past. Have they resurrected the direwolf? No, I believe that's an entirely false claim. But it does help raise revenue. The reason I think it damages trust is because it it makes it seem that if you have enough money, you can basically claim that you've done whatever you want, even if you actually haven't. Um, and insofar that we don't hold scientific claims up to sufficient scrutiny, the general members of the public may have lower trust in science overall.
When we hold the two examples that we've presented so far up to the light, the direwolves case is clearly far less serious an erosion of trust to the syphilis case that we discussed. We're not talking about people being harmed. We're not talking about people being very seriously injured or dying, as was the case in the syphilis example. So what's the problem here? What's any different to the way that non-science organizations proceed that is different in a case where we say we've done something and we're very proud of it.
Yeah. I mean, I think the key difference is we need, when people make scientific claims, it doesn't matter where, who they are, where they're from, they need to make their data available so that they can be scrutinized by other scientists. In colossal biosciences, they just haven't really done that. There's no published paper that's undergone rigorous peer review that substantiates the claims they've made. And insofar as scientific claims leak via communications entities, and that includes, unfortunately, the media. Some media did report quite credulously on this. Um, and then other people turn around and say, well, that's actually not true. It does make it seem like, as a group, as scientists, we don't really know what we're doing. If we're presenting information that's not rigorous and hasn't been tested, and yet it's being echoed all over the world and nobody can come to agree on it, then why should anybody trust anything any scientist says? I do agree it's not as serious as something like Tuskegee, of course not. But it does undermine the scientific progress, the scientific process, to the degree that we don't robustly investigate all scientific claims that are made before we report on them. So I
So
would say it's
perhaps
almost more of an issue with media and communication than it is in typical academic science.
so if we were beginning to create some different categories for these uh, for these examples of trust. Um, the first one, the syphilis study, we could say that is people within the academic scientific establishment behaving in a way that others might say is um, strongly morally questionable, and I'm sure lots of people would condemn that study and have, of course, condemned that study. For the second example, we're talking there about the challenge of there being different aims within this huge thing we talk about as science.
Yeah.
There are people working within academia that will work within different standards to those working within commercial enterprises and have different needs and aims and ways of proceeding. And the challenge being that the behavior of people in one branch of that will impact on the trust levels of people in the other. That science and society might be lumped all together in a way that is unhelpful for trust. Are there things that organizations can do to mitigate against that? To say, no, we're different. We work in this very rigorous way. Or is, as far as the public are concerned, these things impact trust across the board?
Yeah, I mean, this is a great question, right? And one of the things I like about it is that it shows that trust pervades every single element of society. Whether we're talking about science or politics or anything else, right? There's trust at every level. There's trust between people. There's trust between people in the news they read. There's trust between people in science communication groups. Whenever you have an individual communicating with another individual, there's a social exchange, that necessarily involves trust. And this is just that question on amphetamines. It's just everywhere at every single level. So one way where this gets really, really complicated, and I think showcases your question very nicely, is in questions on how people are meant to be using genomic data at all, right? So if we have a vast data set that contains hopefully anonymized data for thousands, hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people, who should have access to it? And how should that data be controlled, monitored? How should the participants who've donated their data be told about its uses? Every single question around the data, how the data is used, and so forth, is affects trust. Okay. And one way that this has gotten complicated in recent times is there has been a resurgence of what we call scientific racism. So people using genetic data sets to justify racist claims. And we see it a lot right now. We see individuals who are just operating. All you need is a laptop. If you have a laptop, you can download genetic data on open source, and you can say all kinds of stuff. So there's a movement called citizen scientific racism, where people are downloading genetic data from places that are publicly available and then using it to justify all kinds of racist claims. You have groups that are masquerading as legitimate research institutes who are attempting to access data in order to justify claims, again, with scientific racism. It's a really pervasive and concerning issue, and it leads to a lot of important ethical and sociological questions about how trust comes into that, and whether we should make data freely available to everybody, regardless of what they intend to do with it. And some people donate their data with that in mind. They say, I want my data out there, and anyone can do what they want with it. I just want it to further science. Or whether we need it to be controlled better. And I think one possible solution to that, and I see that in a few reports that are coming out in the bioethics space, is that what we need is extreme rigor in what is published in scientific journals. So in major journals that we see, places like Nature and Science, et cetera, they need to have extreme rigor when it comes to reviewing data. And when that system falls apart, we get very negative effects. I can talk about another example of that, but I feel like I'm going on a bit. So
I think I want to draw out there. You've mentioned journals, and I think that's an important. It's a point for us to discuss here as a way that the academic institutions might signal trustworthiness. Is to say, look, there's this big journal. It's a very, very well established peer-reviewed journal. So if there's something in there, then you can trust it. They've got a very robust
correct.
process.
That is the model of science that we operate on.
What is perhaps a challenge is how well that translates outside of the world of academia, and how well the media or other people understand or use that same system. Right? Is I think a lot of people outside of academia won't know that that's a better journal than that one in terms of trustworthiness, or that journal has a really good system, whereas this place that someone might publish, anyone
Yes.
could publish that.
No, I agree with that. In an ideal world, it wouldn't matter. In an ideal world, it'd be if you were published in a journal, it meant that your research had undergone sufficient scientific scrutiny that we could trust that what it was saying was at least methodologically correct. It may not be true, right? And research is revised all the time and new data come out, whatever. That's part of the scientific process. But in terms of standing up to scrutiny, it shouldn't be the case that any journal is better than any other. Um, and as you might expect with any system, it's just not going to be functioning in an ideal way. And never mind even whether Nature is better than Science, is better than New England Journal of Medicine. That's one question that we can even put to the side for the moment. But you have a movement of something called predatory journals, which are essentially mimicking as kind of bad actors, real journals, if you like, and publishing shoddy research. So immediately right there, we lose the ability to say, if you're published in a scientific journal, what you're saying is legitimate. When there are journals that don't live up to the scientific standard, that whole framework for science is damaged. And there's another element of trust right there. And then what you're saying, Jack, becomes even a further layer of complexity when it becomes about communicating scientific work that is published in legitimate places. And that's going to be an operation done by scientific communications firms, by public relations people, by research communications offices, going out and talking to journalists, getting academics to talk to journalists, getting academics to talk about their work. In the broad sphere of science communication, things can go really, really wrong there too. Again, as we saw with the COVID-19 pandemic, when communications are off, it can really damage public trust again. So this just really brings to the fore again that at every single layer, you can have poor actions damaging trust and even making it seem like some of these groups are untrustworthy.
I just want to go back to that bit that you just mentioned in terms in the sort of previous bit around data, and I wanted to just sort of ask you around the difference between, say, like trust in data and trust in the person potentially communicating around that data and what how that or what that difference might look like.
I mean, that's an interesting question. And I think then you almost get into the philosophical space of if we're gonna if we're gonna say we trust something, I think we want to be implying that that thing is at least in theory capable of being trustworthy. I don't think data are trustworthy or not. It's just
Mm,
information. And for me, when it comes to can we trust, when we're asking can we trust data, what we're really saying is, are we sure that this is a complete and coherent data set that has been collected in a rigorous way? And are we sure that people have conducted a rigorous scientific analysis using that data that will stand up to scrutiny? The data itself does not really come into that equation. It's all about the people working around it.
mm. And we've been focused at the moment a lot around, obviously, because trust is something super personal, and obviously we've been looking purely from organizations and a human perspective. But in terms of trust, what is it that we have kind of learned from basic other examples within, say, like nature, for example, that we can learn more about this kind of our perception of trust in that if yeah, what can we learn?
Oh, this is a really fun field. And there's a lot of interestingly, there's a lot of disinformation in the animal world. At every level, you're going to get mimicry, whether we're talking about cancer cells mimicking normal cells of the human body, whether you're talking about cuckoos, which are birds that lay their eggs in the nests of other species, and those other species believe that those eggs belong to them and therefore raise the cuckoos at their own. Those are called brood parasites. Whether you're talking about chimpanzees and bonobos who falsify calls in order to lead other members of their own groups away from food. Disinformation is everywhere in nature. And when we're trying to combat it, what we want to look at is what are the tactics that the what we can call honest individuals use in order to combat that disinformation. And the worlds of ecology and biology are full of beautiful examples of how animals do that.
Could you give us one that
Well,
you
yeah, I could talk about this all day, so I'll try. I'll just stick with one. There's a very interesting case with brood parasites with cuckoos that again they lay their nests in the eggs of different species, and a lot of members of those own species are duped into raising the offsprings of those cuckoos at a huge evolutionary cost. They don't have offspring of their own as a result in many cases. So what's happened is you have some birds whose eggs have evolved in such a way that they have discernible patterns to the honest parents, to the true parents, who can tell their own eggs from the eggs of cuckoos. And that is what we call in biology a signal. It's a signal of something that is indicative of what it is meant to be. And for us, not with cuckoos and birds, but more broadly, the point of signals is how you demonstrate underlying qualities such as trustworthiness. If we can find the signals that are linked with being a trustworthy individual, then we can provide a means for people who are really honest to differentiate themselves from bad actors who are trying to convince people of things that are not true.
and and give us a sense of where we are with that type of information. Do we have a toolkit right now where we could give to someone and go, these are all the signals that we need to be portraying to make sure that we're expressing trustworthiness? Or are we, yeah, where are we at with that?
I think this is an ongoing body of work that's very, very interesting. And you actually have people who are using this body of research, which is called signaling theory, and applying it to the healthcare space. So there's some good research that's been done, I believe, in Ghana, where you had a group of people that went in and asked members of local groups what it was that they looked for in healthcare professionals that made them more or less trustworthy. And it was stuff that seems quite intuitive. Things like, well, if they seem like they're charging too much for their services, I'm much less likely to trust them, right? And if it looks like they have too much money, I'm much less likely to trust them because it sends a signal that they're out for themselves. as opposed to doing it for the good of the community. And this is a very, it's a small but growing body of research that us in our own group, I hope we can contribute to.
And I'm just sort of going slightly back in terms of that mimicry thing. Jack and I often, when we interact with communities, and we're seeing it more and more now in terms of is AI, and in terms of that that body just getting larger and larger, and people can sort of communicate with that type of thing, which is essentially mimicking having a conversation with a
Yes,
person.
I agree
How
with
do you how do you see, yeah, that we've been talking about like organizations and stuff like that, but where does AI fit in this world as well, of being able to discern, yeah, if that stuff is trustworthy, or that we can trust what we're being told through that portal, really?
So AI has made our job a lot more complicated. I'm not gonna lie. There was kind of a fun example of this. I think it was last year, just after the generative AI was starting to take off, or the year before, I don't remember. But you may have heard of this, where there was a news story about a couple of people who were setting up a fun day out for parents that was based on Willy Wonka. Okay.
Mm.
Do you know what I'm talking about? And they used AI to generate ads for this event that looked really convincing. So it appeared like they'd spent a lot of time and effort and probably money making up these ads that looked convincing enough for people to go along, to pay to go along to this event, when in fact they had not. They just used AI. And the event was a disaster. I mean, they hadn't put anything into it. It was just this sort of depressing room with a couple of tables and some really depressed people standing behind them. And it became a kind of national scandal. You can look it up. It's called the, I don't know, AI Wonka, something like that. And that was just one example, but they get a lot uglier really, really fast, right? Where you have people who are using AI to mimic the voices of people's loved ones in order to extort money out of them. And they say, if somebody that sounds like me calls up, my mom and says, I need help and send me money and so forth. That's become a pervasive problem with AI too. That is definitely entering the scientific space as well, where things are appearing like genuine, rigorous pieces of information or research, which are absolutely not. And that is a huge problem that we need to learn to confront. But there's an interesting concept in biology. I'm sorry I'm talking so much. There's an interesting concept in biology called the Red Queen hypothesis. And this explores how when you have a conflict between two groups, in this case, let's say honest versus dishonest signalers, there's going to be a kind of arms race, which for each tactic one develops, the other will develop another tactic. And AI is unfortunately a tactic that a lot of the times helps dishonest signalers. But what have other people done is they develop tools for detecting AI generated text. So there's things like GPT-0, where you paste some text into it and it will give you the odds that text has been generated by an AI tool. The same with deep fakes. There have been some companies that have grown up in the last year or two that monitor blood flow in images and videos to tell whether it's been generated by AI. So for every tactic that's developed by a bad actor, you're going to get others in response to it. That's the Red Queen effect, and that is just going to continue to explode in complexity as the technology advances.
I think that's kind of good, because these sessions as well is you don't want to make our viewers sort of scared and worried as well, but obviously not to shy away with the way the direction is going. So I guess, yeah, for those that are watching with us, what maybe, yeah, talk a little bit about some of those practical things as the viewer, as the person that is reading a scientific journal, or reading a newspaper piece about something science. What is it that allows them to feel confident in their decision making around that sort of information piece that they're being delivered?
Yeah. Unfortunately, I have the horribly boring response of the best we can do is arm people with education. And the best tool you can give anyone, rather than using some kind of fancy technology or tool to be able to, discern whether something is fake or dishonest, is to be educated enough about science and language and so forth in order to come to their own conclusions, to be able to discern who is trustworthy from who is not. It is all a factor of education, and there's no shortcut for it, unfortunately.
And often a question that we ask our guests on this format is around, I guess, and it's interesting to use this in terms of this conversation that we've had around trust, which is just misconceptions around the fields that we individually talk about. What would you say that you see most in terms of the idea of trust? What do you see when you have conversations with people that is most misconstrued or is not fully understood when you have conversations with people about the
Well,
understanding
it's an
of trust?
interesting, I mean, again, that's a kind of philosophical question, right? If we're using trust in just kind of ordinary language, who's to say that someone's using it wrong? So my colleagues and I have conducted some focus groups with people that rate themselves, they're of different age groups and rate themselves a low or high trust and ask these kinds of questions. What does it mean to you to trust another person? What signals do you look for in trusting another person? And the example we like to use is, let's say that you were going to lend your keys out to a neighbor and you choose between different neighbors. What signals would you look for in the various neighbors to determine they were trustworthy? And conversely, if you were trying to get something out of someone else, what tactics would you use to prove you were trustworthy? And interestingly, a lot of non-technological answers are what came up. They say it's things like word of mouth, it's what I know about them, it's how they appear to me. Some people focused, excuse me, on things like wealth. They said if they're wealthy, I trustworth them. Some people said, if they look like me, I'm more likely to trustworth them. But very interestingly, that the answers to those questions didn't seem that different from probably what would have been the case, a few hundred or even a few thousand years ago if you were to ask people the same things in different languages. These are all social events. They are all the same kinds of questions that determined how we place trust as we evolved in a species. We use simple signals, which unfortunately are sometimes very easy to fake.
I think you've mentioned there the evolution of this idea of trust, and I wondered if we could spend a moment reflecting on your book, Invisible Rivals, and how trust intersects with our societies as they've evolved over recent millennia. What do we know now about the evolution of trust and its importance within the development of human society?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not going to give you the most optimistic answer, but basically, there are huge debates going on in evolutionary biology today and the evolutionary social sciences today about whether people are fundamentally a cooperative or competitive species. Are we altruistic? Are we selfish? We really like these kinds of binaries, right? You got people, and these debates have been going on for a long time. Even before Darwin, people have been saying, "Are we good? Are we bad?" That's essentially what we're asking. I think those are always false dichotomies. And humans have the capacity to be cooperative, and we have the capacity to be competitive. And what's going to vary is the conditions under which we do one or the other, which to me doesn't sound like a super controversial and it may be a slightly obvious thing to say, but believe me when I say a lot of people don't agree with that, and they want to take one extreme or the other. But the consequence of adopting a more synergistic or complex view is that there's no simple way in which we can argue that cooperative bonds are necessarily going to form in society, right? So part of what we call cultural evolution, when groups increase in size, their cultures become more complex, and we develop social norms and religious rituals and all kinds of other institutions that enable us to promote cooperation within groups. We have to look at how those things evolved. Why is it that we have rituals? Why is it that we have social norms that we stick to very closely? What do those practices tell us about how we evolved to signal information to other human beings? One thing I've liked to focus on in my work, for example, is accents, which is a fun subject because they're kind of funny. But there's a reason accents are ubiquitous, and that's because they give social information about the speaker's identity. And they have undoubtedly been important in interpersonal interactions throughout our evolutionary history. And whether someone is speaking with a real or fake accent will be an important part of how people place or whether they place trust in them. That's just one example, but signals are across our groups.
It's a beautiful example, and it reminds me again of the Traitors TV show that I mentioned in the last series. One of the participants affected an accent that was more trustworthy than her own in order to try and signal her
And
trust.
out of curiosity, could people tell she was faking it?
Well, on the show, I don't think she was called out on it. It was partly she was from the area that she was
Ah.
bringing out an accent of hers. I think that's a fascinating topic that we'll have to return to because I can see we're at the end of our time.
Oh no.
But I wanted perhaps just to close out by raising the point that you made earlier that our biggest combat to trust is educating ourselves. And of course, the best way for people to do that is to join us on more Genomics Lite videos in the future. So please do remember to subscribe. I'm going to wrap up by saying thank you so much to Jonathan for joining us on this Genomics Lite. And Sam, what have we got coming up on the next Genomics Lite?
Yes. So, and thank you for watching. Yeah, next month we return by looking at what is the microbiome. So, what is the marvelous world within us, all those microorganisms within our body acting and performing different functions, and what do they do? So we're going to be finding out a little bit more about that, and yeah, spreading that educational word across the world. So yeah, do tune in. You'll be able to click notify me after this video ends. But yes, thank you for watching this one. We hope to see you next month.
Thank you.